Madison Square Garden had a different shine in 1998. The All-Star Game wasn't just a game, it was a global spectacle, the showcase where established stars showed off to the world and where young players dreamed of making a name for themselves. And in the middle of those lights was Kobe Bryant, only 19 years old, with that daring smile and a walk that seemed to say, "This league is already mine." He wasn't the leader of the Lakers nor the face of the West, but he had achieved the unthinkable, being a starter in an All-Star Game thanks to the fans' vote. To the public, he was a magnetic, electric young man, impossible to ignore, but to many veterans, seeing a teenager walk like the owner of the biggest stage in basketball had a bitter taste. The atmosphere was charged, flashes, cameras, the expectation of a historic duel. On the outside, it was a party, but in the air floated an invisible tension. Everyone knew that this night was not just any other, it was the future colliding head-on with the present. The story doesn't start at the Madison, but a year earlier in Cleveland. 1997 All-Star Weekend, Kobe Bryant, just 18 years old, wins the dunk contest with a mix of charisma and daring that hadn't been seen since Dominique Wilkins' days. It was the between-the-legs dunk that catapulted him, a technical move, but above all, a shout to the world that someone different had arrived. For the NBA, it was perfect, a charismatic teenager with a poster-worthy smile and spectacular game. But for the veterans, it was something else. That dunk wasn't just a trick, it was a symbol. The kid from Philadelphia, who wasn't even a starter on the Lakers yet, was stealing headlines, advertising contracts, and minutes on SportsCenter. In a league with very clear hierarchies, this hit the locker room like a slap in the face. And it wasn't just perception. If you look at the numbers from that first season, Kobe didn't average more than 15 minutes on the court with barely 7 points per game. Just another bench player. The talent was there, but there was still no substance in terms of team responsibility. And yet the next year, he was voted in as a starter for the All-Star Game. Why? Because for the public, there was no need to wait. They wanted the show. That contrast is striking. It shows something that would follow him throughout his entire career. Kobe was always bigger in the fans' imagination than in the role his own teammates gave him. He knew this himself, and instead of stepping down from that pedestal, he used it as fuel. They saw him as cocky? Even better. The press called him arrogant? Perfect. Kobe didn't want to be accepted, he wanted to be impossible to ignore. That's why when he walked into the Madison in 1998, it wasn't as just a sophomore. He walked in as the guy who had already learned how to use attention, fame, and pressure to his advantage, and that showman who mesmerized the crowd was exactly what made the old guard of the NBA nervous. To understand what happened that night at the Madison, you have to pause on a detail that might seem minor but wasn't. Kobe Bryant, at just 19 years old and not a starter for the Lakers, suddenly appeared in the starting lineup for the West. Not because his coach picked him, not because his numbers justified a guaranteed spot, but because the fans voted him in en masse. At that time, the All-Star system allowed fans to choose the 5 starters from each conference. And of course, Kobe had already become a marketing magnet. The Adidas commercials, the Jordan successor hype, the Hollywood smile, and that spectacular style of play, that was enough for millions of people around the world to cast their votes. But what for the public was a dream come true, for many within the league was almost a sign of disrespect. Let's think about it. On the Lakers, Shaquille O'Neal was still there, already one of the most dominant players in the NBA, and Eddie Jones, a seasoned shooting guard, was a regular starter. Kobe, on the other hand, was averaging around 15 points per game coming off the bench and still hadn't proven himself in the playoffs. And suddenly, that kid was stepping onto the biggest stage ahead of guys who had been bleeding for years in the league just to earn that recognition. Veterans felt like a high school kid had crashed their private party, not because he lacked talent, but because he hadn't paid his due. In an NBA where hierarchy was everything, this was almost sacrilegious, and the most incredible thing is that Kobe knew this. He didn't hide from it. On the contrary, he smiled, high-fived everyone, and walked with the confidence of someone who already saw himself as the future face of the league. That contrast between what he projected and what others were willing to accept was the spark that ignited the tension that night. And of course, if there was a king sitting on the throne, seeing a 19-year-old walk in like he was the natural heir wasn't something that was going to go unnoticed, especially when that king was named Michael Jordan. In 1998, Michael Jordan wasn't just the best player in the world, he was basketball. He was coming off 5 championships, he had been finals MVP in each of them, and that season, he was leading the Chicago Bulls toward what would become their 6th title. He was at the peak of his power, and everyone knew it. Teammates, rivals, journalists, sponsors. That All-Star Game at the Garden was set to be his last with the Bulls, and it felt like a public coronation before the farewell. The context is key. Jordan didn't just dominate on the court, he dominated off it as well. Brands had him as the most marketable face in sports, the media treated him as an almost untouchable figure, and for many young players, he was the role model. No one dared question his status, no one except Kobe. Because while the veterans from both East and West understood the All-Star Game as a tribute to MJ's legacy, Kobe saw it as the perfect opportunity to stand in front of the king. That contrast made things even more uncomfortable. On one side, the symbol of the NBA's absolute present, on the other, a 19-year-old kid who wasn't willing to wait his turn to claim the future. And what makes that All-Star Game so fascinating is that, in reality, it wasn't a duel of stats or highlights. It was a clash of symbols. Jordan, with his calculated style and quiet dominance, marked his territory with every possession, and Kobe, with his youthful boldness, tried to show that the stage, or the name in front of him, didn't intimidate him. For the veterans, this was more than just an exhibition game. It was a reminder that there was a line of succession, and it couldn't be skipped overnight. For Kobe, it was exactly the opposite. If you wanted the throne, you had to take it from the king, not wait for him to hand it over. That generational clash, that exchange of glances at the Garden, was the essence of what played out that night. A teenager trying to ascend to the throne before his time, and an emperor who wasn't ready to step down just yet. The 1998 All-Star Game wasn't just Kobe versus Jordan, it was Kobe versus an entire generation that had grown up with a very clear code. First you show respect, then you speak, and for them, that code wasn't negotiable. In the West, Kobe had alongside him Karl Malone, the reigning MVP, a guy who had spent over a decade carrying Utah on his back. There was also Gary Payton, the Glove, known for his suffocating defense and for not giving away even half a smile to anyone, and on the perimeter, Eddie Jones, his Lakers teammate, who at that moment was still the starting shooting guard for the team. All of them represented the same thing, the old guard that had survived the 90s through sheer muscle, playoff battles, injuries, failures, and thousands of hours logged in the league. To them, watching a 19-year-old kid play as if he were already the face of the West felt like a provocation. It wasn't that they doubted his talent, they saw it every day, they knew what Kobe could do with the ball, but they felt he was skipping steps that had cost them blood and years to earn. That discomfort translated into small gestures. Plays where they looked the other way, passes that didn't quite make it to his hands, or glances that seemed to say, "Slow down, kid." Nothing explicit, but just enough for everyone to understand that Kobe didn't have a free pass on that court. And the same thing was happening in the East. Reggie Miller, Tim Hardaway, Penny Hardaway, players who had gone toe-to-toe with Jordan, who had endured painful losses, all looked at Kobe with a mix of curiosity and distrust. It was as if the old guard, even divided by conference, had formed a silent pact, marked their territory. That atmosphere wasn't typical of an all-star game. Normally it was all about the show, the smiles, the let's have fun vibe, but that night had a different energy. There was a sense of a test that every move Kobe made was being judged by the veterans. And that tension is what turned that game into something more than just an exhibition. It became an old-school initiation ritual, with the key difference being that Kobe wasn't willing to stay quiet and play by the rules. If there's one image that defines that 1998 All-Star Game, it's Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan face to face. It was what everyone had been waiting for, the self-proclaimed heir against the undisputed king. And Jordan, far from avoiding the challenge, sought it out several times. In the middle of the first quarter, Kobe squared up against MJ in one-on-one situations. These weren't just regular plays, they were power duels. Kobe tried to show off his full repertoire, those quick fakes, the step backs that would later become his signature moves. And Jordan responded with his usual game: patience, poise, reading the moment, picking the exact time to strike or to let Kobe feel his presence on defense. There's a delicious detail from that night that often gets overlooked. Jordan didn't just face him, he taught him. During timeouts and even in the middle of plays, he threw lines at Kobe that were half advice, half warning. One of the most remembered was when he told him, "If you're going to copy my moves, do it right." That was pure Jordan, recognizing in Kobe a reflection of himself, but making it clear he still had years to go before mastering that mirror. The difference between them was obvious not only in skill, but in emotion. Jordan played with the calm of someone who had already won everything, who knew exactly when to step on the gas and when to ease off. Kobe, on the other hand, was bursting with energy, hungry, trying to prove every second that he could go toe-to-toe with the greatest. That contrast became the show within the show. And the Garden understood it. Every time Kobe called for the ball and went at Jordan, the arena vibrated differently. It was as if everyone in the crowd knew they were watching a historic clash, a passing of the torch that in truth wasn't going to happen that night because Jordan wasn't ready to give it up. That face-off wasn't just a highlight for the fans, it was the moment when the old guard made their message clear, and Kobe made his just as loud. One was defending the present, the other, although not yet on the same level, showed that he had no intention of waiting his turn to claim the future. The All-Star Game has always been a show of smiles, hugs, and impossible alley-oops, but that night at Madison Square Garden, while the world was enjoying Kobe's flashes of brilliance, something else was happening on the court. There were no shoves, no punches, not even an explicit sign of violence. What there was something subtler, and perhaps more cruel, a silent boycott. Because if you look at the box score, Kobe finished with 18 points, the highest scorer for the West, but the surprising part isn't how much he scored, it's how he scored. Forcing shots, creating plays out of nothing, fighting to get the ball in his hands. In several stretches of the game, especially in the first half, it was clear that his own teammates were ignoring him. Eddie Jones, his teammate on the Lakers and starter ahead of him, barely looked for him in the offense. Karl Malone, the league MVP, seemed more interested in asserting his authority than in sharing the spotlight with a teenager who hadn't won anything yet. And Gary Payton, with his fiery personality, wasn't about to gift anyone an easy possession. For many fans in the stands, this went unnoticed. They were too entertained by the dunks and the one-on-one matchups, but for those who understand locker room dynamics, the message was obvious. The veterans didn't want the new king narrative to take hold too quickly, and they expressed that in the most effective way possible in an all-star game by denying him the ball. What took place was almost an initiation ritual disguised as a celebration. The old guard was testing the kid, measuring him, putting up invisible walls. They didn't need to yell at him or knock him down, they just had to leave him alone, make him swim against the current, show him that in the NBA, respect isn't inherited through fan votes, it's earned through hard-fought battles. And Kobe? Well, Kobe chose not to lower his head. He chose to do what he would always do throughout his career, challenge the silence with points, with shots, with that seemingly unshakable confidence. That was his first trial by fire, and the most incredible part is that instead of burning up, he began to forge himself. The logical thing would have been for a 19-year-old kid to shrink, to, after feeling how even his own teammates were side-eyeing him and denying him the ball, simply enjoy the show from the sidelines, wait for a few minutes of action, and then head back to the bench. But Kobe didn't have that chip. On the contrary, every time the ball touched his hands, he treated it like it was the last of his life. The result was clear: 18 points, the most on the Western team. And they weren't empty points. They were spectacular dunks, textbook jumpers, and that relentless energy that made him move like he was playing a Game 7 in the playoffs. There was no hiding it. Bryant was obsessed with proving he deserved to be there, even if everything around him was telling him otherwise. If you go back and watch the footage, you see a Kobe who never hides. He attacks Michael Jordan again and again, hunts every pick and roll like it's a chance to leave a mark, and celebrates each bucket with a mix of euphoria and defiance. That hunger was what set him apart. Where other teenagers would have crumbled under the pressure, he saw a chance to write the first chapter of his legend. Of course, for many veterans, that attitude only confirmed what they already thought. This kid doesn't respect anything, he's just here to steal the spotlight. But for the fans, the takeaway was different. Who was this kid bold enough to go at Jordan in his last All-Star game as a Bull? Where did that confidence come from? That night, Kobe didn't win the game. The East walked away with the victory, but he won something more valuable. He became a name impossible to ignore. On the stat sheet, his line, 18 points, 6 rebounds, and a couple of assists, didn't rewrite history. But in the narrative of the NBA, it meant something else entirely. The future had arrived, dressed in purple and gold, and it wasn't going to ask for permission to enter. The game ended, the East won 135-114, and what had been a vibrant show for most fans turned into a much deeper debate for the press. Because while the cameras focused on Michael Jordan's 23 points, which earned him the MVP of the game, the headlines also spoke of that teenager who dared to challenge him without blinking. Newspapers at the time described Kobe as the future of the league, but that future came with shades of nuance. For some journalists, Bryant's performance was proof that the NBA had a new face ready to take over from Jordan. Others, however, called him a flashy kid, too focused on shining for the cameras, more concerned with highlights than with integrating into the team game. That duality was constant. In New York, the Daily News described him as the kid who stole the Garden's attention, even on a Jordan night. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, some columnists were already wondering if he was skipping steps too fast, if that thirst for the spotlight might clash with the process of building a team that still had Shaquille O'Neal and Eddie Jones as established stars. What's interesting is that the contrast between how the media saw him and how players felt about him was stark. For the press, Kobe was cover material, a phenomenon that attracted clicks before clicks even existed. For the veterans, he was insolence. That clash between media narrative and locker room reality is what gave that all-star a special weight. It wasn't just about what happened on the court, it was also about what was written afterward. And Kobe, far from being uncomfortable with that divided narrative, used it as fuel. In later interviews, he'd say he understood the criticism, but that he wasn't going to apologize for competing at full throttle. And that mentality, which in 1998 was seen as arrogance, would, over time, become the essence of the Mamba mentality. If the stands at Madison Square Garden were hosting a spectacular show, what was happening in the locker rooms was even more revealing. The flashes and cameras only showed the surface. Jordan laughing, players joking, the glamour of stars in the front row. But behind the facade in the hallways, there was a murmur that never made it to the broadcast. The veterans, those who had carried the weight of the league for years, were uncomfortable with the presence of a kid who hadn't yet earned collective merits. To them, Kobe was pure talent, yes, but also a bold upstart stealing the spotlight that wasn't his. Hierarchy was earned through time and scars, not spectacular dunks or a charismatic smile. Even Jordan himself, more diplomatic though he was, made it clear through his body language that he wasn't going to give Bryant anything for free. There are accounts that during breaks, amidst the jokes, he'd also challenge Kobe. Play well, but don't forget who's boss here. It was as if the entire locker room had agreed to remind Kobe that the NBA wasn't a playground but a territory of respect. And yet the most fascinating thing was the reaction of the young number 8 from the Lakers. Instead of withdrawing, asking for fewer minutes, or avoiding confrontation, Kobe seemed to feed off that tension. Where others might have felt shame, he saw opportunity. If they didn't give him the ball, he demanded it louder. If Jordan guarded him, he looked to face him head on. If the neighborhood saw him as an intruder, he was determined to prove he could pay any price to stay there. In that locker room, heavy with egos and history, stood a teenager who didn't want to wait for an invitation to the table. He wanted his place, and that audacity, that almost childlike stubbornness to refuse a not yet, is what began to forge the legend of Kobe Bryant. The 1998 All-Star Game went down in the books as just another exhibition match, with Jordan lifting the MVP trophy and the East celebrating at the Garden. But in reality, it was much more than that. It was a rehearsal for what was to come. That encounter between a Michael Jordan at his peak and a still green but hungry Kobe Bryant symbolized the beginning of the NBA's generational transition. It wasn't immediate, as Jordan would still retire as champion with the Bulls a few months later. But the seed had already been planted. There was a kid who wasn't willing to wait his turn, who wanted to challenge the throne of the greatest player of all time, and who wasn't afraid to do it on the biggest stage. What's interesting is that Kobe came away from that experience with more than just stats. He learned to use rejection as fuel. He understood that in a league where respect is measured by rings and scars, he couldn't convince anyone with words. He had to win, he had to prove it, and that mindset stayed with him forever. Every doubtful glance, every pass denied, every dismissive gesture became fuel for that competitive obsession we would later know as the Mamba mentality. Many remember the '98 All-Star as Jordan's last great show with the Bulls, but seen from the perspective of time, it was also Kobe's prologue. A reminder that even when the present still dominated, the future was already knocking on the door. And it did so with the force of someone who would never accept a wait your turn. That day didn't change the story on the scoreboard, but it did in the narrative. Because every time a new prodigy tried to break into the NBA, Kobe already knew how it felt to be in their shoes. And more than once, he himself would become the guardian, testing those who came after him. When the 1998 All-Star Game is remembered today, most frame it as Michael Jordan's last great celebration with the Bulls. But if we look with different eyes, what we really saw was something else. A 19-year-old kid walking into a locker room where nobody wanted him and leaving with 18 points in his pocket as if he hadn't heard a single whisper from those around him. The veterans wanted to mark their territory, limit his touches, remind him he wasn't yet ready to sit at the table of the greats. And yet all they accomplished was making Kobe understand a truth that would stay with him until the end. In the NBA, nobody gives you anything. Respect isn't asked for, it's earned. That game at the Garden wasn't his coronation, it was his baptism by fire. A kind of collective warning that, instead of breaking him, only made him stronger. Years later, when Kobe was already the undisputed leader of the Lakers and young players tried to challenge him, he himself played the role of the old guard. He became the guardian of the throne, the one who made you pay for every attempt to displace him. And there lies the irony, the very resistance that marked him against Jordan in '98, he would return with interest to the next generation. So then, what was that night in New York really? A public humiliation for a kid who was ahead of his time? Or the exact spark that ignited the obsession that would end up building the Mamba who changed the NBA forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.